Hi guys, and welcome to day 20 of Lent. We are now halfway through. Today we're looking at the raising of Lazarus through John chapter 11, verses 38 to 46. Jesus was once again deeply troubled with himself. He came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was placed in front of it. "Take away the stone," Jesus said. "But Master," said Martha, the dead man's sister, "there'll be a smell. It's the 4th day already." "Didn't I tell you," said Jesus, "that if you believed you would see God's glory?" So they took the stone away. Jesus lifted up his eyes. "Thank you, Father," he said, "for hearing me. I know you always hear me, but I've said this because of the crowd standing around, so that they may believe that you sent me." With these words he gave a loud shout, "Lazarus, come!" And the dead man came out. He was tied up, hand and foot, with strips of linen, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. "Untie him," said Jesus, "and let him go." The result of all this was that the several of the Judeans who had come to Mary, who had seen what he had done, believed in him, but some of them went off to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. We saw a program on the television last night about the fossilized remains of what looks like an ancient race of creatures. They seem to be like humans, but much taller. They appear to have been significantly different from any monkeys or apes known to us. Now, the archaeologists are teaming up with the explorers, all this taking place in some of the remotest mountains of China, to see if these creatures might still exist. It's an exciting story and a remarkable prospect, but I am fascinated by the way in which the archaeologists piece together their finds. Here is a fossil, which seems to be part of an animal. Here is a bone, which might be part of the same animal. Here is a piece of hair stuck to a rock deep inside a cave high in the mountains. Could they all go together? Could one of these puzzles explain the others? The present passage is one of the most dramatic moments in the whole story of Jesus. When Jesus raised Jairus' daughter, he ordered almost everyone out of the room, and when it was over, he told them not to tell anyone. Now he stands in front of a large crowd, puts his reputation on the line, and shouts to Lazarus to come out. The tomb, like many at the time, was clearly a cave with a large stone across its mouth. And the dead man comes out. A heart-stopping moment of shuddering horror and overwhelming joy, mixed together like dark mud and liquid gold. All this is hugely important. If we don't feel its power and find ourselves driven to awe and thanks and hope, then either we haven't learned to read or we have hearts of stone. There must have been many other newly buried people Jesus didn't attempt to raise. There is a mystery about this moment which is bound up with the mysterious uniqueness of Jesus' own work. He brought God's love and power into sharp and clear focus in one small place. Only then would it go out to the rest of the world. This passage raises these questions for us quite sharply. But the raising of Lazarus isn't itself the most extraordinary thing about this passage. The most extraordinary thing is what isn't said, but what provides the link between the two puzzles that we are otherwise facing, like the archaeologists trying to put together a fossil and a bone. To begin with, we have an unanswered comment from Martha. Good old Martha, we think, always fussing and anxious, wanting to do her best, even at a time like this. "Master," she says, "you can't take away the stone. There'll be a smell." She knows perfectly well that a human body, particularly in a warm climate, will begin to putrefy within at most 3 days of death. That's why many in that part of the world bury their dead the very first day. John doesn't have Jesus answer her, except with an oblique comment. If she believes she will see God's glory, somehow where he is going to do will achieve that. But the question remains, what's happened to Lazarus' body? Will it have started to decay? The other unexplained bit of evidence is what Jesus says when they take the stone away. He doesn't pray that he will now have the power to raise Lazarus. He thanks the Father that he has heard him. And he adds on a little extra sentence about wanting to show the people around that they will believe in him. How do we put those two bits of evidence together and make sense of them? John has omitted, but surely wants us to understand and to be struck all the more powerfully for having to work it out, that when they took the stone away from the tomb, there was no smell. From that moment on, Jesus knew that Lazarus was not dead, or was dead no longer. His body had not begun to decompose. All that was required now was a word of command, and he would come out, a shuffling, sightless figure, to be unwrapped and released into the world of life and light. But we are left pondering how Jesus had got to that point. There is only one conclusion that we can draw, and it's very striking. In those 2 silent days, the other side of the Jordan, before he even told his disciples of the problem, he was praying that, though Lazarus would die, he would be preserved from corruption, praying that when eventually they arrived at Bethany, the body in the tomb would be whole and complete, ready to be summoned back into life. And when they took the stone away, he knew that his prayer had been answered. This, of course, raises the other question, which looms up behind the story. The disciples warned Jesus that to go back to Judea again was to court death. Thomas, gloomily accepting this as inevitable, proposes that they go and die with him. Jesus, meanwhile, has been praying for a dear and now dead friend, praying that his body will not decay in the days after death and burial, but that he will be ready to come back to life. We cannot but connect the two, the fate of Lazarus and the fate of Jesus. We cannot but suppose that Jesus, in praying for Lazarus and raising him to life, was aware that he was walking towards his own death and praying his way into the Father's will for what would happen thereafter. Of course, there are differences. Lazarus came back into ordinary human life. For him, the process of death was simply reversed. He could still become ill again. One day, he too would die, and there were some who wanted to make that happen sooner rather than later. But the journey Jesus would make would be through death and out the other side into a new sort of life. For the moment, we pause and reflect not only on the power of God, but on the faith and prayer of Jesus. So often we find 2 or 3 parts of our life which pose us the same sort of puzzle that we find in this text that should go together, but we can't quite see how. We should remember that in this story, the unspoken clue to all of this was prayer and faith. If Jesus needed to spend time praying and waiting, how much more will we? So reflection today. Reflect on the dramatic scene of Lazarus being raised from the dead. What emotions does this evoke in you? Consider how the mixture of horror and joy in this moment reflects the complexities of life and death. And consider the role of prayer and faith in this passage. Reflect on Jesus' silent days of prayer before raising Lazarus and his awareness of his own impending death. How does prayer help you to navigate the puzzles and complexities that you encounter? I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I know for me it invokes the reminder of the importance of persistence in prayer. I've heard so many times stories where people have prayed for friends to come to Christ and to come to know God and Jesus, and to remain faithful in their prayer, knowing that God will answer it in his own good time. And years have gone past, and people have come to faith. Many of us, most of us, would probably have given up after a week, a month, a year maybe. But some people have prayed for years, decades, for their friends or their family, loved ones to be saved. And eventually, Jesus has brought them to God. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. See you tomorrow.